So this week's Torah portion is Lech-Lecha, or Go Forth. A few years ago, I presented a sermon on which of God's commandments we're supposed to keep today. I found this to be a common question in conversations, both with people who are new to Torah and people who have been walking in Torah for years. Today's commentary will be a follow-up to that message. This simple timeline shows all history from Adam to almost where we are now. We see the Mosaic covenant put in place at the time of Moses and ending at the time of Christ. As we know, God delivered the 10 Commandments and the rest of Torah to the Israelites through Moses. When I listen to the mainstream church, the conception I usually get is that the Torah was then in place until Jesus was killed and then resurrected. The idea is that the Torah was only for that time. Or there's another school of thought where the Torah is only for the Jews and the Gentiles don't have to keep it. And I've heard Christians use both schools of thought at the same time to determine that we don't need to keep Torah today. However, as we can see on this timeline, even before Moses, there was Abraham. Moses and the rest of the Israelites were descended from him. Abraham lived before the Mosaic covenant and before the Torah was given through Moses. However, when we look at this week's portion, we see that Abraham kept similar laws that we see in the Torah that was later relayed through Moses. In Genesis 12:7, Abram built an altar like God later commanded several times in the law of Moses. Noah also built an altar even earlier than this in Genesis 8. In verses 15 through 17, Yahweh punished adultery, which is also forbidden in the 10 Commandments given to Moses. In the Torah, God commanded that Moses' brother Aaron and Aaron's sons were to be anointed as priests. In Genesis 14:18 through 19, we see Melchizedek was the priest before Aaron was even born. Abram gave Melchizedek a tithe in 14:20. Later, in Numbers 18, God commanded that the tithes be given to the Levites. Levi, the patriarch of the Levites, hadn't even been born at this point. In Genesis 15:9 through 11 and 17 through 18, we have animal offerings to God like in Torah. This also occurred even earlier with Abel in Genesis 4 and Noah in Genesis 8. In chapter 17, verses 9 through 12, we have circumcision on the 8th day after birth, which God later commanded in Leviticus 12. And in Genesis 17, 13 through 14, we also have circumcision of those bought with money, which God commanded later in Exodus 12 in regards to the Passover. The Bible doesn't give us any accounts of any law being written down before Moses, but based on the actions of Abel, Noah, and Abraham, we see that God probably communicated a similar law to them. So we see a carrying over of commandments from Genesis to the Mosaic covenant, but with some differences. We also see carryover of commandments from the Mosaic covenant to the New Covenant, as Yeshua and the New Testament authors reference several commandments. For example, Jesus' discourse on adultery in Matthew 5, which we will look at later. So it looks like we have a form of commandments continuing after the Mosaic covenant and into Yeshua's New Covenant as well. But what about these other laws? Before discussing adultery in Matthew 5, Jesus said in verse 17, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven." So which commandments do we follow today? All of them. So then the new question is, how do we follow the commandments today? To answer this, let's first consider why many churches teach we don't have to keep the law. One reason often given is the Jerusalem Council ruling in Acts 15 about Gentiles coming into the faith. Verse 1, "And certain men came down from Judea and taught the brethren, unless you are circumcised according to the custom of Moses, you cannot be saved. Therefore, when Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and dispute with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain others of them should go up to Jerusalem to the apostles and elders about this question. So there was a dispute over whether or not Gentiles coming into the faith had to get circumcised. Recall, this is one of the commandments we saw with Abraham in this week's portion, and that's stated in the law of Moses. Now, I highly recommend watching Daniel's Galatians on Earth series for further detail on this chapter and the topic of circumcision. For now, we'll jump to the conclusion. Verse 19. Therefore, I judge that we should not trouble those from among the Gentiles who are turning to God, but that we write to them to abstain from things polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, from things strangled, and from blood. For Moses has had throughout many generations those who preach him in every city, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath. They decided not to trouble them with circumcision. However, James listed other commandments for them to keep and mentioned that Moses had been preached widely for a long time. The understanding was that the Gentiles would continue learning the law. So why skip on circumcision? Well, as mentioned, Daniel covered that in the Galatians study, but I believe a good single passage to sum it up comes from Paul in Colossians 2:11. In him you are also circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ. They didn't skip circumcision. They had received a better circumcision, a spiritual circumcision. How did Paul come to this conclusion? He realized that there is more to the law than just what was written down. Romans 7:6. But now we have been delivered from the law, having died to what we were held by, so that we should serve in the newness of the Spirit and not in the oldness of the letter. Verse 14. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. Paul appears to refer to a couple concepts here about the law, the Spirit and the letter. To help explain how I understand them, let's go back to that timeline from earlier. It looks like three different sets of laws, but we actually have God's single, consistent law. Psalm 119:89, forever, O Yahweh, your word is settled in heaven. The spirit of the law never changes. However, the letter of the law changes depending on what covenant we're in. And it can even change within a covenant. For example, when the ark left the tabernacle and eventually settled in the temple, the spirit of the tabernacle laws was then applied to the temple, all while under the Mosaic covenant. Here's an analogy. Think of the spirit of the law as cookie dough. It is a lot of substance, but not a firm, steady shape, so it's harder to describe. The covenants are like cookie cutters. They have several shapes for the different laws. Some of the shapes between sets, between covenants, are identical. After we use the cutters on the dough, we do have firm, solid shapes that are much easier to describe and put in words. For example, the law of Moses, as we have written, are the cookies produced from the cookie dough through the Mosaic covenant cookie cutters. The cookies for the different covenants may look a little different, but they are all made from the same dough, the same spirit of the law. Let's look at an example of the letter and spirit of the law from Scripture. Earlier, we looked at adultery being sin in all three covenants. Here's what Yeshua had to say about it in Matthew 5, verse 27. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. The part boxed in red is from the Ten Commandments, Exodus 20:14 and Deuteronomy 5:18. It's the letter of the law. The part in blue is Jesus' commentary on it. It's the spirit, the intent of the law. The Torah is usually expressed by stating physical actions that are forbidden, permitted, or required. These are the finished cookies of the Mosaic covenant. But the spirit of the Torah involves where our hearts and minds are supposed to be based on the commandments. When I hear people discuss how to keep Torah today, like what calendar to follow or what exactly constitutes unleavened bread, etc., I find they usually spend most of their time talking about the letter of the law and Jewish traditions. And that can make sense because we only have the letter of the law for the Mosaic covenant. But we need to heed Paul's warning in 2 Corinthians 3:6. God also made us sufficient as ministers of the new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. When we study the letter of Torah, we need to do so in prayer to help us learn the spirit of Torah. Studying the rest of the Tanakh outside of the Torah will help with this, like Genesis in this week's portion. Then we need to apply what we learn of the spirit of the law to Yeshua's new covenant so we can walk it out today. And that's not something that can be completed in one commentary, one sermon, or even one series. Again, I highly recommend Daniel's Galatians series for some examples. But this will take continued study of the Torah and of Jesus' teachings the rest of our lives to help us continually grow closer to him and learn how to follow the commandments today. Shabbat Shalom.